The night was cold and restless. Rain poured heavily, drenching the dense forest that surrounded Jack's small cabin on the outskirts of town. Jack, a retired engineer in his mid-40s, had settled into his quiet routine. The world outside barely mattered to him anymore. He had traded the chaos of the city for peace, and the cabin was his sanctuary. As Jack sipped on his evening tea, a loud crash startled him. It sounded like something, or someone, had fallen nearby. The forest was full of wildlife, but this noise was different. It was close, heavy, and unusual. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his flashlight, pulled on his raincoat, and ventured out into the storm. The rain was relentless, soaking through his coat as he trudged through the muddy trails. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing only the tall trees and wet undergrowth. Just as he was about to turn back, thinking it was probably a fallen branch, he saw something. There, lying motionless on the wet ground, was a girl, but she wasn't just any girl. Her skin was pale blue, smooth like polished stone, and her white hair glistened faintly even under the dim light of the storm. She was young, perhaps no older than 10, and dressed in what looked like a torn jumpsuit made of a material Jack couldn't recognize. Her fragile frame trembled, and she clutched something tightly in her small hands, a pendant, intricate and otherworldly in its design. "Hey, are you all right?" Jack called out, kneeling beside her. She didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes remained closed. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around the woods. What was she doing here, in the middle of nowhere? Who was she? Questions swirled in his mind, but the urgency of her condition pushed them aside. He carefully picked her up, surprised by how light she felt, and hurried back to the cabin. Inside, Jack placed her gently on the couch by the fire. She was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably. He grabbed a blanket, wrapping it around her tiny frame, and stoked the fire until it roared with warmth. For a moment, he stood there, unsure of what to do next. He wasn't a doctor, and there was no hospital nearby. As he watched her, she stirred slightly, mumbling in a language he didn't understand. Her voice was soft, filled with fear and pain. The pendant slipped from her grasp and fell onto the couch. Jack picked it up, marveling at its design. It shimmered faintly, etched with symbols that seemed almost alive. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. "Who are you?" he whispered, more to himself than to her. She didn't answer. Instead, her breathing steadied as the warmth of the fire enveloped her. Relieved, Jack sat back, keeping an eye on her as he tried to make sense of the situation. A part of him wanted to call the authorities, but something held him back. She didn't look dangerous, just lost, scared, and in need of help. Hours passed, and the storm outside began to calm. The girl stirred again, her eyes fluttering open. They were a deep, vibrant silver, filled with a mix of fear and confusion. When she saw Jack, she shrank back into the couch, clutching the blanket tightly. "It's okay," Jack said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe here." She didn't speak, but her trembling eased slightly. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two strangers brought together by the storm. Jack knew, deep down, that his quiet life had just been upended. Whoever this girl was, she wasn't ordinary. And whatever had brought her here, it wasn't by accident. The rain continued to fall softly outside, but inside the cabin, the air was thick with unspoken questions and a sense of something far greater looming just beyond the horizon. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the forest bathed in soft sunlight. Inside the cabin, Jack sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee. His eyes kept drifting to the girl, who was now awake but sitting silently on the couch, wrapped in the blanket. She watched him cautiously, her silver eyes flickering with unease. Jack decided to break the silence. "Do you have a name?" he asked, his voice calm and gentle. The girl didn't respond. Instead, she clutched the pendant around her neck, as if it were her only lifeline. Jack didn't press her. He figured she must be scared, alone, and confused. He couldn't blame her for being wary of a stranger. "I'm Jack," he said, placing a plate of scrambled eggs and toast on the small table near her. "You should eat. You look like you need it." She glanced at the plate, but made no move toward it. Jack sighed and sat back down, giving her space. He wasn't sure what he had gotten himself into, but he knew he couldn't just leave her to fend for herself. After a long pause, the girl reached out hesitantly and picked up a piece of toast. She nibbled at it slowly, her movements delicate and careful. Jack watched with relief as she began to eat. "Good," he said with a small smile. "You'll feel better with some food in you." She looked at him then, her eyes softening slightly. There was still fear, but it was mixed with curiosity now. Jack saw it as a good sign. Throughout the day, Jack went about his usual tasks, occasionally checking on the girl. She followed him with her gaze, her expressions shifting between wonder and caution. At one point, she stood up and wandered toward the workbench in the corner of the room, where Jack kept his old tools and projects. "You interested in that?" Jack asked, noticing her curiosity. The girl pointed at a small device that Jack had been trying to fix, a broken handheld radio. She tilted her head, examining it closely, then looked at Jack as if asking for permission. "Go ahead," he said, curious to see what she would do. To Jack's amazement, she picked up the radio and began fiddling with it. Her slender fingers moved with surprising precision, rearranging wires and components. Within minutes, a faint crackle of static emitted from the speaker. Jack blinked in disbelief. "You fixed it." The girl nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it lit up her otherwise solemn face. Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, you're full of surprises, aren't you?" That small interaction seemed to break the ice. The girl began to relax a little more, though she still didn't speak. Jack decided to give her a name, at least until she felt comfortable sharing her real one. "I think I'll call you Area," he said, glancing at her. "It suits you." The girl didn't protest, which Jack took as a sign that she didn't mind. Over the next few days, Area slowly adjusted to life in the cabin. She started helping Jack with small tasks, fixing things he had long given up on. Her intelligence and skill amazed him. She was clearly no ordinary child. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Area finally spoke. Her voice was soft and hesitant, her words broken but understandable. "Thank you," she said, her silver eyes meeting his. Jack smiled warmly. "You're welcome, Area. You're safe here." Her face softened, and for the first time, Jack saw a glimmer of trust in her expression. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Whatever her story was, Jack knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn his back on her now. As the night deepened, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Area's presence in his life was no accident. He didn't know where she had come from or why, but he was determined to protect her, no matter the cost. Days turned into weeks, and Area had settled into life at the cabin. Jack couldn't help but admire how quickly she adapted. Though she spoke little, her actions spoke volumes. She was clever, quick to learn, and far more capable than her small frame suggested. One chilly morning, Jack decided they needed supplies. The cabin was running low on food, and a trip to the small town nearby was unavoidable. Area hesitated when he suggested she come along, but Jack assured her it would be fine. "You'll need a hoodie," he said, handing her an old, oversized one. "It'll keep you warm and help you blend in." Area nodded, slipping it on and pulling the hood over her pale hair. Jack handed her a pair of sunglasses to hide her unusual eyes. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror by the door and then at Jack, her expression asking, "Will this work?" "You'll be fine," he said with a reassuring smile. "Stick close to me." The town was bustling with activity when they arrived. Jack parked his truck outside the general store and glanced at Area, who sat nervously in the passenger seat. "Just stay by my side." "Okay." Area nodded, her small hands clutching the pendant around her neck. Jack noticed the way she held it, as though it was her only connection to something, or someone, she'd lost. Inside the store, Jack greeted the shopkeeper and began filling his basket with essentials. Arya stayed close, her eyes darting around the store, taking in the sights and sounds of the busy little town. No one seemed to pay her much attention, which put Jack at ease. But then it happened. As Jack was paying at the counter, a man entered the store. He was tall, with sharp features and piercing green eyes that seemed to scan the room with purpose. His clothes were plain, but something about him made Jack uneasy. The man's gaze lingered on Arya, who instinctively moved closer to Jack. Jack noticed and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "You have a cute kid," the man said suddenly, his tone casual but his eyes cold. "Not from around here, is she?" Jack forced a smile. "Just visiting. She's shy." The man tilted his head slightly, studying Arya for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he turned his attention back to Jack. "Watch the company you keep," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Before Jack could respond, the man walked out, disappearing into the crowd outside. Arya's grip on Jack's arm tightened. She didn't say anything, but her trembling spoke volumes. Jack quickly finished up and guided her back to the truck. "You okay?" he asked as they drove home. Arya nodded, but Jack could tell she wasn't. He wasn't either. The man's words replayed in his mind. There was something off about him, something dangerous. That night, as they sat by the fire, Arya suddenly reached for her pendant. She pressed it, and to Jack's astonishment, a faint holographic projection flickered to life. Strange symbols and an unfamiliar crest hovered in the air. Jack stared, trying to make sense of it. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low and careful. Arya hesitated, then whispered, "Home." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "Where's home, Arya?" She didn't answer, her silver eyes filled with sadness and fear. Jack realized then that she wasn't just different, she was extraordinary, and whatever, or whoever, was after her wasn't going to stop easily. That night, Jack barely slept. The stranger's warning, the projection from Arya's pendant, and the unspoken truths between them all pointed to one thing: danger was closing in. And Jack knew he had to be ready. The following days were tense. Jack kept a closer eye on Arya, and she seemed to sense his unease. She spent most of her time near the cabin's windows, her silver eyes scanning the woods. Something had shifted between them, an unspoken understanding that danger was near. One evening, Jack was repairing a broken generator in the backyard when he spotted a faint glimmer in the sky. It was too slow to be a shooting star and too steady to be a plane. His heart sank as he realized what it was: a drone. Unmarked, silent, and moving with precision, it hovered briefly before disappearing behind the treetops. Jack rushed inside, his face pale. "Arya," he called. She was already at the window, clutching her pendant, her face pale with fear. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Arya nodded, her hands trembling. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Bad people," she finally whispered. "Want me?" Jack knelt beside her. "Why? What do they want?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know everything, but I'm important. My family, gone. I ran. They chase." Jack's chest tightened. This wasn't just a lost child. She was the key to something far bigger, and now those people, whoever they were, knew she was here. He had to act fast. "We can't stay here," he said firmly. "It's not safe anymore." Jack spent the next few hours gathering essentials: food, tools, and a few weapons he kept for emergencies. Arya watched him silently, her expression a mix of guilt and fear. When he noticed her hesitating near the door, he knelt down and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Listen, Arya," he said softly. "This isn't your fault. We're in this together now. I promise to keep you safe, and I will." Her silver eyes glistened with tears, but she nodded. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they left the cabin behind, Jack driving his old truck down the narrow forest road. The air was thick with tension. Jack kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or a drone tailing them. They drove through the night, finally stopping at an abandoned hunting lodge deep in the woods. Jack had discovered it years ago while hiking and knew it would be a good temporary hideout. "This will do for now," he said, unloading their supplies. "We'll stay here until I figure out our next move." Arya helped silently, her small hands carrying whatever she could manage. Despite her fear, she was determined to help. Jack admired her resilience. She was tougher than she looked. As they settled in, Jack tried to piece together what little he knew. Arya's pendant, her royal lineage, the man in the store, and now the drones. It all pointed to one conclusion. She was being hunted because she mattered. To whom and why? He didn't yet know. Later that night, Jack sat by the fire, his mind racing. Arya was asleep on the couch, her pendant glowing faintly as it rested on her chest. He wondered what kind of life she had left behind. Did she have people who cared about her? A family who was mourning her loss? Or was she truly alone now? His thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound outside, like the hum of machinery. Jack froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle by his side. He crept to the window and peeked out. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was the unmistakable red light of a drone scanning the area. They had found them. Jack's mind raced. He couldn't afford to panic. Turning back to Arya, he shook her gently awake. "Arya, we have to go. Now." She sat up, her eyes wide with fear but filled with determination. Together, they grabbed their bags and slipped out the back, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. As they moved through the dark, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whoever was chasing Arya wouldn't stop, and he would have to do everything in his power to protect her. The hunt had begun. The forest was eerily quiet as Jack and Arya moved through the dense underbrush. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath their boots and the occasional distant hum of drones. Jack's mind raced as he led them deeper into the woods, searching for any place they could find cover. After what felt like hours, they came across an old ranger's station, long abandoned and overrun by nature. Ivy climbed its walls, and the windows were cracked, but it was shelter. Jack motioned for Arya to follow him inside. The station was small but functional. There was a dusty table, a few broken chairs, and a rusty old locker in the corner. Jack barricaded the door as best as he could, then turned to Arya. She sat quietly on the floor, clutching her pendant, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and fear. "You okay?" Jack asked, kneeling beside her. She nodded faintly but didn't speak. Jack could see she was holding back tears, trying to be strong. He sighed and leaned against the wall, running a hand through his hair. "We can't keep running blind," he said softly. "I need to know what's going on, Arya. Who's after you? Why are they so desperate to find you?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, with trembling fingers, she activated her pendant. The faint blue holographic projection flickered to life, casting strange symbols into the dim room. Jack stared at it, trying to make sense of the alien writing. "My family," Arya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were important. My parents, leaders, they wanted peace." Jack listened carefully, his brows furrowing. "And the people chasing you, who are they?" "Bad people," she said, her silver eyes filling with sadness. "They hurt my family, took everything. I ran. They want this." She pointed to the pendant, her fingers trembling. "It's proof of who I am." Jack's chest tightened. He finally understood. Arya wasn't just a scared child. She was the last survivor of a royal family. And this pendant wasn't just a keepsake. It was evidence of her lineage, likely capable of rallying her people or exposing the crimes of those hunting her. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked gently. Arya looked down, her voice breaking. "Didn't know. If I could trust." Jack placed a hand on her shoulder. "You can trust me, Arya. I'm here to help." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears. For the first time, Jack saw the full weight of the burden she carried. A child forced into a fight she didn't choose, with enemies far more powerful than either of them could comprehend. As they sat in silence, Jack's mind raced. They couldn't keep running forever. If this pendant was as important as Arya said, it might be the key to getting her out of danger. But how could he use it without attracting more enemies? His thoughts were interrupted by a distant sound, the low rumble of engines. Jack's heart sank. They had been found again. "Arya, we have to move," he said quickly, helping her to her feet. "No," she said suddenly, gripping his arm. "We can't keep running. They'll always find us." Her words struck Jack like a blow. She was right. Running wasn't enough. They needed a plan, something that would give them the upper hand. He glanced at the pendant in her hand, its faint glow seeming almost hopeful. "Then we fight," Jack said firmly. "But not on their terms. We'll find a way to use this, your proof. If they're scared of what it can do, it's our best weapon." Arya nodded, her fear replaced by a glimmer of determination. Jack felt a surge of protectiveness. She might be young and vulnerable, but she was also brave. Together, they would find a way to end this. As the hum of drones grew louder, Jack grabbed their bags and led Arya out the back. The forest was dark, but he moved with purpose, his resolve stronger than ever. They weren't just running anymore. They were preparing for a fight. And Jack knew one thing for sure. Whoever was chasing Arya was about to learn just how resourceful a determined human could be. The forest stretched endlessly before them as Jack and Arya pressed on, the sound of drones fading into the distance. Their escape had been close, too close. Jack's mind raced as he tried to think of their next move. They couldn't keep running aimlessly. They needed help, someone who could decipher the secrets of Arya's pendant and give them a chance to fight back. After hours of walking, Jack decided they needed rest. They found shelter in a small cave tucked into a rocky hillside. It was damp and cold, but it was hidden. Jack lit a small fire while Arya sat quietly, her hands wrapped around her knees. The exhaustion on her face was clear. "Arya," Jack said, his tone softer than usual. "I have a friend. Someone who might be able to help us." Her silver eyes met his, questioning but hopeful. "His name is Marcus," Jack explained. "He's different, like you in a way. He worked with technology far beyond what most of us understand. If anyone can figure out how to use that pendant, it's him." Arya nodded slowly. "You trust him?" "I do," Jack said firmly. "He's a bit strange, but he's a good man." With a plan in mind, Jack allowed them a few hours of rest before they set out again. The journey to Marcus's secluded home was long and treacherous, but Jack knew the risk was worth it. By the time they arrived, the sun was setting. Marcus's home was a cluttered, bunker-like structure built into the side of a hill, surrounded by an overgrown garden of strange plants. The faint hum of machinery buzzed from inside. Jack knocked on the heavy metal door. It slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing a wiry man with wild gray hair and sharp, calculating eyes. Marcus's gaze flicked between Jack and Arya, his expression unreadable. "Jack," Marcus said, his voice gruff. "Didn't expect to see you here. Who's the kid?" "It's a long story," Jack replied. "We need your help." Marcus stepped aside, gesturing them in. "You've got my attention." Inside, the bunker was as chaotic as Marcus himself. Tables were piled high with tools, gadgets, and half-finished projects. Screens lined the walls, displaying data streams and schematics that Jack couldn't begin to understand. Once seated, Jack explained everything: finding Arya, the pendant, and the people hunting her. Marcus listened intently, his sharp eyes narrowing as Jack spoke. When Arya activated her pendant to show him the projection, Marcus leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "This," he muttered, studying the glowing symbols, "isn't just a trinket. This is advanced, far beyond anything Earth's got." "Can you figure out what it does?" Jack asked. Marcus nodded, already pulling out tools and scanning devices. "I'll need time, but yeah, I can crack it." As Marcus worked, Jack and Arya sat nearby, watching in silence. Arya's fingers fidgeted nervously, her gaze darting to the door every few minutes. Jack noticed and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're safe here," he said. "Marcus might look like a mad scientist, but he knows how to stay off the radar." Hours passed, and finally Marcus leaned back with a triumphant grin. "Got it," he said, holding up the pendant. "This thing isn't just proof of her lineage. It's a beacon." "A beacon," Jack echoed, his stomach sinking. Marcus nodded. "It can send a signal to her people, wherever they are. But activating it will also draw attention from anyone tracking it. It's a double-edged sword." Arya's eyes widened. "My people, they can come." "Potentially," Marcus said, "but it's a gamble. If the wrong people get here first." Before he could finish, a loud explosion rocked the bunker. The screens flickered, and Marcus cursed under his breath. "They found us." Jack grabbed Arya, pulling her to cover as the door began to buckle under heavy fire. "Marcus, can you shut it down?" "Already on it," Marcus shouted, frantically typing at his console. The door burst open, and armed figures stormed in, their faces obscured by helmets. Jack's instincts kicked in, and he grabbed a makeshift weapon, a heavy wrench, while shielding Arya. "Stay down," Jack yelled. The invaders weren't prepared for Marcus's defenses. Automated turrets popped out from the walls, firing a barrage of energy blasts. Jack took advantage of the chaos, taking down one of the attackers with a well-aimed swing. Arya watched, her fear turning into determination. "Marcus, the pendant," Jack shouted. Marcus threw the pendant to Jack. "Get her out of here. I'll hold them off." Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed Arya's hand and bolted out the back exit, the sounds of battle echoing behind them. As they ran into the night, Jack glanced at Arya. She was clutching his arm tightly, her silver eyes shining with fear and something else. Jack and Arya sprinted through the dense forest, their breaths heavy and their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The faint sounds of gunfire and Marcus's makeshift defenses echoed in the distance, growing fainter with each step. Jack's heart pounded as he clutched the pendant in one hand and guided Arya with the other. "We'll find a place to regroup," Jack said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Marcus will hold them off." Arya didn't respond, but her grip on his arm tightened. Her silver eyes darted to the pendant in his hand. She knew as well as Jack did, this small object was both their salvation and their greatest risk. They stopped hours later, deep in a secluded part of the forest. Jack found a small clearing surrounded by thick trees and boulders, a natural barrier that offered some security. He collapsed onto the ground, breathing heavily, and gestured for Arya to sit. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, though her face showed exhaustion and worry. "Marcus, he'll be okay." Jack hesitated. If anyone can handle themselves, it's him. But we can't go back. Not yet. He held up the pendant, its faint blue glow barely visible in the darkness. "This thing is powerful." Marcus said it's a beacon. "It can call your people, Arya. We could end this." "But danger," Arya whispered, her eyes filled with doubt. "They will come too." Jack nodded. "That's the risk. But running isn't working anymore. If we can reach a safer place, somewhere we can activate it and stand our ground, we might have a chance." Arya's small hands reached for the pendant, her fingers brushing its surface. "It can save us," she said softly, then looked at Jack with newfound determination. We do it. Jack smiled faintly. He admired her courage, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Then we'll figure out how. As dawn approached, they began their journey again. Jack recalled an old ranger tower deep in the mountains, a place remote enough to buy them some time but high enough to send the beacon without interference. The trek was grueling, but Arya kept pace, her quiet resolve pushing her forward. They reached the base of the tower by midday. The structure was old and weathered, but it still stood tall against the rugged terrain. Jack climbed the rickety stairs first, testing their strength, then helped Arya up. At the top, the view was breathtaking. Rolling hills and endless forests stretched as far as the eye could see. But Jack's focus remained on their mission. "This is it," he said, pulling the pendant from his pocket. "Once we activate this, we'll be exposed. They'll come for us, but so will your people." Arya's hands trembled slightly as she took the pendant from him. She closed her eyes and pressed its center, her lips moving as she whispered something Jack couldn't understand. The pendant began to glow brighter, its light casting strange patterns across the tower's walls. A soft hum filled the air, growing louder until it was almost deafening. Jack's eyes widened as a beam of light shot into the sky, piercing through the clouds. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. "It's done," Arya said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "They will come." Moments later, Jack's worst fears were realized. The distant roar of engines echoed through the mountains. A fleet of small, sleek ships appeared on the horizon, their dark forms cutting through the sky like predators. "Here we go," Jack muttered, gripping the rifle he had brought from Marcus's bunker. "Stay behind me, Arya." The ships descended, and figures began to emerge, armored soldiers with advanced weapons, their movements precise and calculated. But Jack wasn't going to back down. He positioned himself in front of Arya, his stance firm. "You want her?" He shouted at the approaching soldiers. "You'll have to go through me." To his surprise, Arya stepped forward, her silver eyes glowing with a fierce determination Jack hadn't seen before. "No," she said firmly. "We fight together." As the first soldier charged, Jack and Arya stood side by side. With her quick thinking and the ability she was only beginning to understand, and Jack's ingenuity and grit, they faced the enemy head-on. The odds were against them, but Jack knew one thing for sure. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for freedom, for Arya's future, and for the hope that somewhere out there, help was on its way. The Ranger Tower stood tall against the stormy skies, its silhouette framed by the advancing fleet of sleek, black ships. Jack tightened his grip on his rifle, his heart pounding as he watched the soldiers move in perfect formation toward the tower. They were organized, relentless, and heavily armed. Beside him, Arya stood calm, her small frame straight and unyielding. The pendant around her neck glowed brighter, as if sensing the impending battle. Jack glanced at her, amazed by the courage in her silver eyes. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded. "We fight. Together." Jack gave her a small, proud smile. "All right, kid. Let's show them what we're made of." The first wave of soldiers approached, their weapons raised. Jack fired a warning shot, the sharp crack echoing through the mountains. "That's close enough," he shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. The soldiers didn't stop. Instead, they split into groups, flanking the tower with military precision. Jack's gut twisted. These weren't just mercenaries. They were trained for this. "Arya, stay low," he barked, taking aim. But before he could fire again, Arya raised her hand. A shimmering barrier of light appeared between them and the soldiers. Jack stared in shock as the first volley of energy blasts struck the barrier and dissipated harmlessly. "Did you just do that?" Jack asked, glancing at her. Arya looked at her hand, surprised but focused. "I think I can protect us." "Good," Jack said, grinning despite the chaos. "Keep it up." The fight intensified. Jack's sharp aim and quick thinking kept the soldiers at bay, while Arya used her newfound abilities to shield them and disarm their attackers. Each time a soldier fired, she countered with a flash of light or an energy pulse that sent them scrambling. But the enemy kept coming, relentless and determined. Jack's ammunition was running low, and Arya's energy was visibly draining. Her breaths grew heavier, and her hands trembled as she maintained the barrier. "We can't hold them forever," Jack shouted over the noise. "How long until your people get here?" Arya closed her eyes, her face strained. "Soon," she whispered. "They're coming." Jack nodded grimly. "We just need to hold out a little longer." Suddenly, a deafening roar filled the air. Jack looked up and saw a massive ship descending from the clouds. It was unlike the smaller crafts, sleek, silver, and adorned with intricate designs. Its presence commanded attention, and the soldiers on the ground froze, their weapons lowering. Arya's eyes lit up with recognition. "It's them," she said, her voice filled with hope. "My people." The ship landed with a thunderous impact, and from its side emerged a group of figures clad in elegant armor, their movements swift and purposeful. They carried weapons, but their focus was on the soldiers who had been attacking the tower. A standoff ensued. The new arrivals raised their weapons, and the enemy soldiers hesitated. Jack could feel the tension crackling in the air. One of the armored figures stepped forward, their helmet retracting to reveal a regal face with the same pale blue skin and silver eyes as Arya. "Stand down," the figure commanded, their voice firm and authoritative. The enemy soldiers hesitated before retreating, disappearing into their ships. Within moments, they were gone, leaving behind only the hum of their engines fading into the distance. Arya's people approached the tower. The leader, who introduced herself as Commander Elara, knelt before Arya, her expression softening. "Princess," she said, her tone reverent, "we've been searching for you." Jack's jaw dropped. "Princess," he muttered, looking at Arya. Arya turned to him, a shy but grateful smile on her face. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Jack shook his head. "You don't have to thank me, kid. Just glad you're safe." Commander Elara extended a hand to Jack. "You have our eternal gratitude, Earthling. You risked everything to protect her." Jack accepted the handshake, though he felt out of place among the grandeur of their arrival. "She's a good kid," he said simply, "just doing what anyone would do." Arya stepped forward, her silver eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and sadness. "You come with us?" she asked hesitantly. Jack hesitated. This wasn't his world. It never was. "This is your fight, Arya," he said gently. "But if you ever need me, you know where to find me." Tears welled in Arya's eyes, but she nodded. "I'll come back," she promised. As she boarded the ship, Jack watched her go, his heart heavy but proud. The ship rose into the sky, disappearing among the clouds, leaving Jack alone in the quiet forest. The fight was over, but Jack knew his life had changed forever. Somewhere out there, a young princess was reclaiming her destiny, and a small part of him was with her, always. The forest was still as Jack stood at the base of the ranger tower, staring at the sky where Arya's ship had disappeared. The sounds of the battle had faded, leaving only the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. For the first time in weeks, the tension in his chest eased, replaced by a bittersweet ache. Arya was gone, safe, on her way back to the world where she truly belonged. Jack should have felt relief, but instead, his cabin in the woods suddenly seemed lonelier than ever. The days passed quietly. Jack returned to his cabin and tried to slip back into his old routine. Chopping wood, fixing small engines, and taking care of the garden kept his hands busy, but his mind often wandered. He would catch himself glancing at the chair by the fire where Arya used to sit or listening for the faint hum of a drone in the distance. Life was peaceful again, but it felt empty. One evening, as Jack sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, he noticed something glinting in the twilight. He frowned and leaned forward. It wasn't a star, nor was it a plane. The object grew larger as it approached, its sleek design unmistakable. Jack's heart raced. He stood, the coffee forgotten, as a small silver craft landed softly in the clearing near his cabin. The door slid open, and a familiar figure stepped out. "Aria," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and disbelief. The young girl ran toward him, her silver eyes shining with joy. "Jack," she called, throwing her arms around him. Jack knelt to meet her, a grin breaking across his face. "What are you doing here? I thought you were with your people." "I am," she said, stepping back, but keeping a firm hold on his hands. "But I wanted to see you, to say thank you properly." Behind her, a tall figure exited the craft. A regal woman with the same pale blue skin and silver eyes. Jack recognized her as Commander Ilara. She approached with a respectful nod. "Jack," Ilara said, her voice warm. "The princess insisted on this visit. It seems she's grown quite attached to you." Jack chuckled, ruffling Aria's hair. "She's a hard kid not to like." Aria held up her pendant, now fully restored and gleaming brightly. "I'm learning," she said proudly, "about my family, my people. But I don't forget what you taught me." Jack's throat tightened. He hadn't realized how much of himself he had poured into protecting her, guiding her. Seeing her stand taller, braver, and more confident than ever filled him with pride. Commander Ilara stepped forward. "You did more than protect her, Jack. You showed her humanity's strength, compassion, resilience, and ingenuity. For that, our people owe you a debt." Jack waved it off. "I didn't do it for a reward. She needed help. That's all." Ilara smiled. "And that is why you are remarkable." The visit was brief but meaningful. Aria spent hours sitting by the fire with Jack, sharing stories of her people and their efforts to rebuild after the rebellion. Jack listened, his heart swelling with pride at how far she had come. As the evening turned to night, it was time for Aria and Ilara to leave. Standing in the clearing, Aria looked up at Jack, tears shimmering in her eyes. "I'll come back," she said softly. "I promise." Jack nodded, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I'll be here." Aria hugged him tightly one last time before boarding the craft. Jack watched as the ship ascended into the sky, its lights twinkling like a star before disappearing into the night. Life returned to its quiet rhythm for Jack. But this time, the loneliness was replaced with a sense of purpose. He knew he had made a difference, not just for Aria, but for her entire world. And though she was far away, he felt a connection that would never fade. On clear nights, Jack often sat on his porch, staring at the stars. Somewhere out there, a young princess was carrying forward the lessons she had learned from an old Earthling. And in the vastness of the universe, that bond was unbreakable. For Jack, the adventure might have ended, but the memories and the hope would stay with him forever.